You're listening to Rail Technology Magazine's Track Talk podcast to guide you through the news, views and inside stories from across the rail industry. Welcome to this episode of Rail Technology Magazine's Track Talk podcast, where today we'll be discussing all things weather resilience and what the industry can learn in this area from other countries. And we'll be joined by Dr Brian Haddock, Head of Seasonal and Weather Resilience at Network Rail. So thanks for joining us today on this podcast. It's a really pleasure to have you with us, Brian. And would you be able to tell us a bit about your role as Head of Seasonal and Weather Resilience at Network Rail and what it entails?
Of course, yeah. Thank you, Connor. Yeah, so I'm Brian Haddock. I'm the Head of the Weather Resilience at Network Rail within Systems Operator. And I chair the Industry Seasonal Challenge Working Group, which has representatives from all train operators, freight operators, Network Rail routes and regions. I'm also a visiting professor at Newcastle University and helping the delivery of the 5 key recommendations from the Dame Julia Slingo report following Stonehaven. So I have a team that sit at the kind of national perspective that support all routes and regions, and every route and region has a seasonal delivery specialist, and most have a seasonal delivery manager that oversees the sort of strategy, the seasonal planning and preparation and delivery throughout autumn, summer and winter. Funny enough, we don't tend to focus on spring. It's a bit of time where we actually get respite and do lots of reviews. I suppose the key part of my team are looking at seasonal assurance. So we assure all the planning and processes for every season well in advance. So I suppose if I take it back, every season we undertake a national review. And that collates all the information from all the routes and regions reviews of what actually went on during their autumn, during their summer, during their winter. These reviews normally take place quite soon after the season. They bring in their train operators and they bring in performance teams and freight operators, and they discuss what was good and what was bad about the season. And to be fair, they have monthly meetings which are called joint seasonal management group meetings, and some routes and regions have joint seasonal management boards as well that gets all locally gets reported to, including all the operators and anything that might need escalation for discussion. So once the reviews have taken place, all the lessons learnt are captured and they're built into the next season's delivery and planning, and they're through working arrangements. So you have special working arrangements for each season. And that involves the control, because the control really at the sharp end of the delivery of each season anyway. So what we then have is, as we get closer towards the season, say sort of 5 or 6 months out, you have the seasonal stage gate process, which is a series of 3 stage gates. The first stage gate, as I said, will be kind of kicked off around about the 5-month mark out, and it'll ask some basic questions about, are you thinking about these key things? And that's for all delivery units, for train operators, for controls, and to do all the duty holders know that they're accountable for the delivery of each stage gate. And then if there are any risks that are identified at stage gate 1, then there are plans put in place by stage gate 2 to make sure that those risks have been reduced. And obviously, if they continue then a couple months out into stage gate 3, the final stage gate before the actual delivery of the season ahead, then they're discussed and they're put on a priority risk, and they're escalated to the Network Performance Board, which oversee the sort of overall delivery of seasons and seasonality at an industry level. And those risks are discussed and plans are put in place to make sure that they're best monitored over the period of that season. That's kind of the process of the stage gates. What we have realised is that there are a number of things within those stage gates which the assurance is quite dependent on trust. So there's a lot of questions in those stage gate processes, lots of things that delivery units have to sign off against, and there's a realisation that our own assurance process probably needs to be a little bit more robust. We do need to observe some of these activities which we currently don't do. We need to make sure that they are being undertaken, even at a very basic level, given that there isn't always resource to do all of this stuff. And some of it is currently done by remote condition monitoring, for instance, rather than actual visual inspections. And there's a plus and a minus for that. So we obviously don't want to put more people out on the track. But at the same time, we do need to make sure that we're getting the right information to give us the risk profile through each season, at every point of that season, especially given the forecast that we get. So yeah, there's a general overview of the seasonal stage gate process. There's a lot more to it. There's an integrated weather management plan that has all the high risks that sit within that aid memoir, if you like, within the control. And any given forecast will alert certain thresholds as extreme or adverse. If they're extreme over a period of 24 hours in the forecast, then the route control manager will check all the high risk sites against that weather parameter. So for instance, if it would be heat in the southeast, it might cause some desiccation of earthworks in the longer term. They would have to look to see whether there's any engineering work that's going on. If it's extreme heat, then there's a potential that the line can't be moved. You can't take out bits of rail if it's going to get too hot. And equally, if there's work going on that are stressing the rail, they've got to check that things can be stressed or non-stressed depending on the temperature outside, and whether you should actually move the rail at all or the ballast. So there's all those thoughts to be considered.
You talk about forecast there, but how do you work around that? Because obviously forecast can only tell you so much. So how do you make yourself and Network Rail prepared for any eventuality when it comes to weather and seasonality?
It's a good question. So over the years, we've built the Network Rail Weather Services site, and it's currently by our forecast provider, MetDesk. And we have 6 weekly meetings with MetDesk where we review the current situation, we review the current forecast, and we look to see what tools that we've got and how we might develop them based on learning from incidents and from general seasonality at local level and at national level. And we've built a lot of bespoke tools in that forecasting kit. So for instance, we've got a bespoke forecasting tool for conductor rail, for the southern region and for Merseyrail in particular. We have bespoke forecasting for overhead line equipment. And obviously that's a lot to do with temperature ranges. But equally, we've got things like overtopping forecasts down at Dawlish Seawall. So that if we get high tides mixed with high winds, for example, at certain times of year, especially at spring tides, then the forecast will recognise that hits a certain threshold, and then we can talk to the train operators to make sure that the mitigations are in place. I mean, for example, the overtopping at Dawlish Seawall would mean that we would work the normal upline, which is against the cliffs, that could be run as bidirectional, so that we can run trains in both directions, closest to the rocks, i.e. not closest to the seawall, where you might get overtopping, which causes all sorts of problems if you have seawater over the top of trains. So that there are things like that are bespoke, that have been built up over the years, and a lot has been built up from learning from incidents to create those bespoke forecasts. And equally, there's a lot of consultation with train operators to do with specific fleet types and their vulnerabilities. There's a lot of learning from December 2010 with ingress of wet snow onto traction motors, for example, and line speeds, so that we know to reduce the train speed at high speeds when we know we've got wetter snow forecasted, for example, the wrong type of snow. And so there's a lot of lessons learned been built there, and that also goes into the seasonal planning around making sure that there are gauzes fitted on, traction motors within depots so that it doesn't ingress that wet snow at high speed. But yeah, so a lot of those forecasting services have been built up over years. I mean, for example, we've got the adhesion forecast as well, which creates the index. And interestingly enough, that's also got incident data built into it. So when you get to sort of the back end of October into early November, we know at that point that's when you've got most leaf fall coming down. Obviously, it varies within a few weeks, and the parameters depending on frost, wind speed, etc. So if you get a sharp frost towards the end of October into November, and then you've got winds forecasted beyond that, then the model automatically works out that your leaf fall risk is quite high, and it actually provides a percentage of leaf fall risk at a root level, and that does vary across the UK. We find out that Scotland tend to get the fall very early on compared to the south, so there's lots of regional variations. One of the problems we've got, Connor, to be totally honest, is having national thresholds. So currently we've got a national threshold for rainfall, but actually you can't compare the rainfall in the northwest and in Scotland to parts of the southeastern Anglia. They're just, they're not comparable. So we are doing a lot of work at the moment with the Met Office to work out those parameters with our asset managers at local level to understand the impact on individual assets, certainly earthworks. What is the impact over there compared to there? To our passengers, our freight users, they don't care. They just don't want to be delayed. So actually, rather than think of kind of at route level, the Seasonal Challenge Steering Group, which are the kind of strategy formation of the 10-year strategy, are working very closely with lots of research, Professor John Beckford at UCL and Loughborough, at working out how do we model these at a local level. And we call them operational route sections, where it's basically station to station, and then you aggregate that risk up into service group levels. And we are starting to get to a point where we can quantify the impact on individual passenger services and freight services, and actually provide information about what the timetable should be to reflect that delay, so that in advance you can work out the impact on that entire service group. So the operator with the Network Rail route can decide what timetable that might look like. And that would be based on the forecast. And in the past, it's been difficult to call that on a forecast because, as you said, sometimes the forecast isn't as accurate, or weather systems tend to do what they want. They sort of turn up and they might sit around the edge of the railway for hours and not affect the railway, and then where it's been forecasted it's slow moving somewhere, suddenly moves slightly to the left or right of that system, and suddenly you've got the rail network, which is essentially a thread through that big geographical forecast area. So we're getting quite clever at trying to understand forecasting for the actual rail network itself rather than the geographical forecast area. But the biggest development in this area will be looking at how we can use topography and the effects over the kind of geology of that area, which is all very different across the UK, as you know, and to understand the impact of that on bespoke forecasting services and risk, so that you come up with a quantified risk for specific areas rather than looking at large geographical forecast areas. That's tricky, but we have started to do that. And as I said, the seasonal agnostic railway model, the SARM, is starting to understand what that looks like and the quantification of impact. That's currently under trial in the western route between Reading and Newbury, and has already started to provide some interesting information in regards to what the impact might be on a specific train in a specific timetable, and then the impacts of that. But of course, the beauty of starting to understand that at a local level and a granular level at individual head codes means that you can see what actually is available. Network rail and train operators have got bad press about this over the years to do with forecast, because essentially what we currently do, certainly for wind, we would blanket emergency speed. So we would just put on a big speed between there and reduce, the speed of the train to reduce the risk of it hitting something, essentially a tree, which is generally the issue with wind, although obviously we get trampolines and bits of stuff all over the overhead line equipment as well, even stables. So what this model starts to do is it realizes that might only affect a part of the network where you can still be running over here. We've not done that before. We've tended to look at a much more sort of generic, larger geographical area. By looking at individually, we can see that one train might be impacted, but the one after might not be, because the system's passed through. It might not be as bad as first forecasted on the observed data, and that you actually provide information in advance to the passengers that their journey might be simply coming through there, changing at one point. So we're getting there. It's slowly, but the model and the information is starting to tell us this. And there's a machine learning element under AI within this model that will really start to define in the future the best options available to the controller when they're trying to make a decision about what trains to run and which ones not to run.
And you spoke there about the innovation we've seen in your area of expertise, but how important is further innovation, and can it replace that experience you've built up over the years?
That's really interesting, Connor, is it? So there's a few questions in there. We haven't got billions and billions of pounds to invest in the railway. Nobody has, and certainly in this current climate. So what we do is, resilience to me is being seasonally agnostic. I'm not keen on the term myself, but it's the agreed term under the industry. But what it's essentially saying is that we're not going to be resilient to every extreme weather event. We just can't be. There's so many unknowns in there, especially about our own asset condition and the way it is impacted by extreme weather and with climate change. But what we do know is that we've often run services when perhaps we shouldn't have done. Sometimes we've run trains at reduced speed for long periods of time because we were worried about the overall risk because the forecast isn't granular enough. And what we're trying to do now is become more resilient in that the timetable is true to the impact that we're going to experience. And that for me is real resilience, because it then provides information to the passengers that actually these are the services that will be run on a forecast, rather than simply look at the forecast. Yes, it looks bad there. Start cutting trains out the timetable. The controls are under immense pressure at the time. They're dealing with incidents ongoing, and at the same time they're still trying to work out train services and what they should be doing with stock and crew. If you've already got that pre-planned, and you can only ever have that pre-planned if it's quantified impact, if you know the impact, then you can start to understand that, you know, resilience might be about running the train service that's fit for the forecast, and that's very different from running services where we're cancelling stuff off because suddenly we're into the middle of it. And what we term out of control situations, which is borrowed from an academic document around the railways in Holland, where a lot of research has been done on this. And we have learned a lot from Holland, actually. I work very closely with ProRail and NS on their forecasting systems and how they divide their network into 4 zones, it might be 5, which basically means that they can alter the timetable basically 4 hours in advance. Don't think we're there yet with the UK Rail. It's a very different structure, obviously, over here in the UK, but there's a lot of lessons to be learned about that, and providing the passengers with true information about what services are actually running in advance. Of course, the risk is sometimes you might get that wrong, and that will be the bit that gets remembered. But generally, most days the controllers do this in their head. And as you said, you know, the experience, tacit knowledge is incredible. And again, that will be part of the sub-model that we're building with Professor John Beckford.
And you mentioned the learning from the Netherlands, and I've been writing recently about what the rail industry can learn from Europe, but what things are happening on the continent that can help improve weather and seasonal resilience on the UK's rail network?
So that's an very interesting question, Connor. One of the things that stands out for me at the moment is forecasting. So probabilistic forecasting is something that the Met Office have been looking at for some time now. We don't actually use it currently under Network Rail Weather Services, but we have used ensemble forecasting for some time. So that does pick up bits of probabilities. At the moment, most transport industry use deterministic forecasting, based on deterministic modelling. Now, we've started to learn from Germany, with the Met Office doing a trial over there on probabilistic forecasting. And we've created with Professor Paul Davis from the Met Office a decider tool. It's called a decider tool. And that gives you probabilistic idea of what the weather looks like over a longer period of time into the future. And they call this the weather regimes, changing weather regimes. Often it isn't actually the extreme weather that catches us out. It's the change between the weather systems that catches us out. Generally, the first hot day in the UK catches us out. By the time we get round to the second or third week of a good summer, our performance levels are getting better and better. So it's understanding how you catch that before you get caught out. Even though we do all this assurance, there's still the element of surprise. I think there's also a few technological solutions that we've looked to Europe for. The magnetic track brakes. So a lot of countries use magnetic track brakes. Very, very handy for autumn because it means that you can use an emergency and the train really does stop. It doesn't matter how much contamination you've got on the railhead. An MTB, the magnetic track brakes, will help you pull up quickly. Anyone that's travelled on a tram knows that because most tram systems, even in the UK, are fitted with them, as are Tyne and Wear Metro. I think that's a big revision of the entire industry, that, because we'd have to really rethink what we're going to do with magnetic track brakes because it affects the signalling systems in the UK. That's quite difficult. I think there's a place for them, but there's a lot of learning perhaps from Europe, and also specification of new train design. So new trains that come into the UK, I think there's an opportunity there for those that are fitted with specific things that they're used to in Europe and other countries with extreme weather that are often not available to us in the UK because they're not designated as required. But with climate change and extremes and frequency of weather events, there may be an opportunity there. There's other things as well. So the adhesion modifiers, things that do clean the railhead in autumn. Plasma track's very interesting. So that's something that we're looking at from the US, where they actually clean the railhead with a plasma beam. And so there are a lot of things in the mix, but a lot of them are being tested, routes and regions, quite vigorously, and also our own supply chain operations, who run all the multi-purpose vehicles for adhesion modifier and water jetting in autumn through to MPVs that anti-ice and de-ice in winter. So, yeah, technologically there's a few things, but I would say probably the forecasting systems that are being trialled in Germany are probably critical. And we're working with Met Office to see that one through.
It's been a real pleasure speaking with you today, Brian, and thanks for your time. Thanks for listening to this episode of Rail Technology Magazine's Track Talk podcast. Join the conversation on social media or get in touch via the link on our website, and stay up to date with all the latest developments within the rail industry. Subscribe and give us a rating on your preferred streaming platform. This has been Rail Technology Magazine's Track Talk podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.